In 2001, the course of U.S. and world history changed. Brand new President George W. Bush was caught in the middle, and the decisions that followed would transform the United States' image to the world and increase distrust between Americans and their government. Still, Bush would lead through some of the greatest tragedies and emergencies the U.S. has faced. This is the complicated legacy of George W. Bush.
To see those two guys standing up there waving in that convention, really, if there was any doubts at all, eradicated it. And the Reagans were very magnanimous people. I mean, they were
George W. Bush was born to political royalty. Son of soon-to-be President H.W. Bush, former vice president during the Reagan administration and World War II veteran, George W. Bush stood well within his father's shadow. Where his father had had success, George W. had struggled. A Yale graduate and Air National Guardsman, George W. Bush had struggled with alcoholism, leading to a DUI in 1976. However, after meeting his wife Laura in 1977, he was able to kick the habit, citing his marriage and his faith. Getting his life put back together, he quickly got into business, where he started an oil company, Bush Exploration, in search of oil deposits around America. However, with oil prices being low in the 1970s, and Bush would ultimately have to consolidate under Spectrum 7 before his business ultimately fell apart. He would later put together an ownership group to buy a controlling share of the Texas Rangers, where he would become a managing general partner.
I am committed to this fight as a parent, a grandparent, and for me it gets right back to education.
As H.W. Bush geared up for presidential election, George W. Bush was brought on to the campaign team as a campaign advisor.
Truth of the matter is, whoever he picks, our family is more than willing to back. He knows better than anybody in the country who would be a good vice president.
The success of the presidential campaign emboldened George W. Bush to seek a position of his own, running for Texas governorship in 1995. It was during his gubernatorial campaign that he came in contact with Karl Rove, who he added to his campaign team. While the campaign was otherwise a clean win, rumors about his opponent's sexuality were later linked to Karl Rove. And this would not be the last time that underhanded tactics would be linked to members within Bush's campaign staff. Bush would win re-election in Texas in 1998. Into 1999, he would set his eyes on the highest office in the land. Bush was back on the campaign trail with Karl Rove in tow.
What would you say is your area of expertise?
Uniting people and setting an agenda that's hopeful and optimistic.
During the Republican primary, Bush suffered a serious setback in New Hampshire, losing to the other Republican nominee, John McCain. The Republican primary had come down to South Carolina, where George W. Bush had to win. With the campaign at stake and with few political differences between himself and John McCain, things began to get a little personal.
He attacks special interests, but the Wall Street Journal reports
McCain's campaign is crawling with lobbyists.
His conservative hometown paper warns
It's time the rest of the nation learns about the McCain we know.
Voters throughout South Carolina began to receive phone calls from anonymous sources asking if they were supporters of John McCain. Supporters of McCain received further questioning if they were aware of John McCain's adopted daughter from Bangladesh, claiming that the daughter was of illegitimate birth from John McCain. While being a false assertion, these rumors took a life of their own in South Carolina and played a big part in Bush's winning of the state. It was around this time that Bush would also announce his running mate, Dick Cheney.
I believe you're looking at the next vice president of the United States.
Having won South Carolina and now having his new vice president on his campaign ticket, George W. Bush went up against the Democratic nominee, Al Gore.
According to our Constitution, there's one day that comes around every 4 years. That day is tomorrow, and I need your vote, and I need your support.
Finally, the election culminated in the most controversial ending in American election history. With Bush and Gore virtually tied, it all came down to the mighty state of Florida.
Suspense is mounting in Florida tonight.
NBC News is now taking Florida out of Vice President Gore's column and putting it back in the too close to call.
After several recounts, court decisions, and appeals, George W. Bush won the election, but by the narrowest of margins. However, George W. would not win the popular vote. Al Gore would, and it would mark the first time since 1988 that the president would win the election despite losing the popular vote. Having won the election, Bush was finally beginning to emerge from his father's shadow. However, an event would happen that would soon completely change the course of his presidency, his legacy, the United States, and the world.
You know, approximately 10 minutes ago, there was a major explosion from probably, it looks like about the 80th floor. It looks like it's affected.
The southern tip of Manhattan, you're looking at the World Trade Center. We understand that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. We don't know anything more than that. We don't know if it was a commercial aircraft. We don't know if it
Bush's early presidency would be a shaky one. With the controversial end to the election, Americans were not quite sure what to make of the son of the former president now sitting in the Oval Office. With an ambitious domestic agenda, Bush sought to establish himself as his own president and not as a mere continuation of his father. However, on September 11th, the world would completely change.
A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
Bravo to Manhattan. 40 Bravo is responding to the World Trade Center. 40 out.
And wedged in the middle of all that pain, grief, and anger was George W. Bush. And he wasted no time in visiting Ground Zero and showing that he was responding.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. I unfortunately will be going back to Washington after my remarks. Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
I can hear you! I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us
soon. Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Bush's visit to Ground Zero, as well as the public unity around 9/11, led to a groundswell in public support for George W. Bush. His approval ratings skyrocketed. In his first speech to the nation after the attacks, Bush would make some statements that would come to define his presidency.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. And we will pursue nations that provide aid or safe haven to terrorism. Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. Our second goal is to prevent regimes that sponsor terror from threatening America or our friends and allies with weapons of mass destruction. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
This axis of evil would justify pressure on Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, as Bush declared them as enemies of the free world. Former staff would note that Bush was obsessed with Iraq, who Bush's counterparts in Britain and Saudi Arabia would note had no connection to Al-Qaeda.
Oh, the reason I keep insisting that there was a relationship between Iraq and Saddam and Al-Qaeda, because there was a relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda.
At the same time, the U.S. would begin its invasion of Afghanistan, quickly ousting the Taliban from government in Kabul and establishing their own democratically elected government. Still, Bush was not done, and neither was his new vice president, Dick Cheney.
Simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
While America's allies assert that there was no connection to Iraq and Al-Qaeda, Bush continued the narrative that Iraq was pursuing a weapons of mass destruction program, and that if Iraq were able to get weapons of mass destruction, that Iraq would destabilize the region and challenge U.S. security.
I remember the fact that he has invaded 2 countries before. I know for a fact that he's poisoned his own people.
The theme would carry throughout 2002 as well.
It possesses and produces chemical and biological weapons. It is seeking nuclear weapons.
I cannot tell you everything that we know, but what I can share with you, when combined with what all of us have learned over the years, is deeply troubling. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction. The nexus of Iraq and terror is old. The combination is lethal.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
In 2003, only a year and a half after 9/11, the US would launch its invasion of Iraq. Saddam was quickly toppled, and the US was responsible for rebuilding a government that could support the Iraqi people. Finally, Bush had achieved some success that distinguished him from his father. President of the United States, vanquisher of Saddam Hussein, unifier of America and the free world, he was finally emerging from his father's shadow. But things would begin to get more complicated. The controversy over the invasion of Iraq would emerge very quickly. Iran and Al-Qaeda would capitalize on the instability of Iraq that America had failed to resolve, and Bush faced mounting criticism for the lack of WMDs found in the country. With the invasion of Iraq permanently staining President Bush and America's image worldwide, another crisis would emerge which would again tarnish Bush's image as a crisis responder. In August 2005, shortly after Bush was inaugurated for his second term in office, Hurricane Katrina made landfall, becoming one of the worst natural disasters in American history. Unlike 9/11, Bush's response to Hurricane Katrina would become the subject of controversy, and it would become an inflection point in his presidency.
Good evening. I'm speaking to you from the city of New Orleans, nearly empty, still partly underwater, and waiting for life and hope to return.
While Bush would quickly release funds to respond to Hurricane Katrina, public outcry at the sluggish federal response to the disaster swelled.
There was certainly a lot to criticize. It was a failure of government at every level.
The most tragic loss of all. George Bush doesn't care about black people.
With unity following 9/11 beginning to fade, and growing disdain for the war in Iraq swelling, and now the poor response to Hurricane Katrina, Bush was becoming increasingly more unpopular.
Coined a term, Bush derangement syndrome, to talk about your critics who disagreed with you most passionately. Not just your policies, but seemed to take an animosity toward you. I'm just wondering, as you look back, why you think you engendered such passionate criticism, animosity, and do you have any message specifically to those, to that particular part of the spectrum of your critics?
In 2007, the storm became financial as the Great Recession began to take shape.
Down 1.7% here, a loss of 37 points or so. Apple shares are just getting hammered this morning.
We're down by between 3 and 4.5% generally across these markets. Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate. We're red everywhere, essentially, down by 4-5%.
Bush wanted to increase regulation on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in 2003. However, the Senate had overruled his bid for more regulation. With subprime mortgages taking over the real estate market and causing a catastrophe, this crisis would expand worldwide. Bush, having undergone many crises in his presidency, would again struggle to react in time.
Major sectors of America's financial system are at risk of shutting down.
Soon after, Bush's final term in office would come to an end, giving way to Barack Obama. Bush would return to Texas. The crises endured during his presidency, as well as the invasion of Iraq, would echo to the present day, and caught in the middle of the soundscape was George W. Bush. George W. Bush carries a complicated legacy to this day. He set out to create an identity beyond his father's shadow, and he succeeded. He unified the country when it needed it the most. And it could be argued that he had no chance to find his footing in his presidency, as crisis after crisis would rock his presidency, and America to its core. Yet decisions like the invasion of Iraq have a lasting impact on the United States and the world. In 2011, the US formally withdrew from Iraq. However, events like the Arab Spring brought forth ISIS, which has kept kept some of U.S. forces in Iraq to this day. In retirement, Bush has taken up hobbies like painting, including painting the faces of American soldiers lost in the Iraq War. There are moments where you can see that the ghosts of his decisions haunt him.
The decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq. Of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway.
He no longer maintains a close relationship with Karl Rove or Dick Cheney, people who played a crucial role in his administration's success, but who also clearly undermined his image.
But you cannot, I don't think you can make a case that the world would be better off today if Saddam Hussein were still in power.
So no regrets about Iraq?
I think we made exactly the right decisions.
He succeeded in achieving the highest office in the free world, but he failed to surround himself with leaders who would do the right thing. This would lead to endless controversies, such as the use of torture, mass surveillance, and the WMD theory sold to the world over Iraq. This leaves his legacy complicated. While there was good, there was tremendous bad. While he charmed America, he tricked the world. While he emerged from his father's shadow, he stood in endless crisis and turmoil. This is the complicated legacy of George W. Bush.
Do us a favor, please. When you call our bosses downtown